Hello, everybody. Welcome to our now October Willis and Friends Conversations. I'm excited to have you joining us again. And as you know, our conversations are about elevating and communicating about this innovation and scientifically based, impactful, transformational approach around advancing early relational health in child health transformation in communities. And I have a great experience and opportunity of bringing my valued friends, colleagues, thought leaders, and thought partners that inspire me that I want to share with you. And today's session is of that kind of an amazing opportunity for us to talk about envisioning a relational future within a multicultural society. Let me tell you a little bit about what this conversation today will be about. Our nation is in the midst of a palpable upheaval from COVID, the economic fallout, and the racial reckoning, and the public dialogues around deep racial and economic inequalities. Yet in a hopeful and futuristic sense, we're all on that cusp of major redesigns of our social compact, with our middle class, our poor, with our young families, our social safety net, and reinvestments. Our future citizenry will be more minority dominant, won't it? And will surely be receiving more immigrants as the world faces the realities of climate change and that, in fact, movement of people. So as we move into our future, we have to focus on short-term, long-term healing of our divisions and the dreadful impacts of COVID, racism, structural inequalities, and all the disconnects. Yet hope springs eternal. And the national dialogue and local dialogue includes these discussions of the need for social connectedness and the authentic conversations of healing. We know that our children of the future must be healthier and much more prepared, and they all need that solid social connection and relational health. So today, I'm just delighted to bring you a conversation with two of my dear friends and colleagues who I most admire as visionaries, Isabelle Howe and Joe Waters. They are amazingly well-read, reflective, deeply connected, wildly innovative, and always hopeful. Let me tell you about each of them before we get into our conversation. I met Isabelle in Chicago with Janet Furshner as when I was with the Parents G Fund. We were in discussions about the need for early 0 to 3 relational measures for children's well-being. And I followed Isabelle as she went off into her sabbatical, and she's created a weekly newsletter online called Small Talks about the future of early learning. Every Friday, she highlights 6 areas of her weekly joys and reflections on early childhood and the whole family. The content of those highlighted areas are: what am I celebrating? What am I listening to? What am I reading? What am I watching? What am I learning and exploring more deeply? And there's always a wonderful quote. Well, over the decades, Isabelle has worked on the intersection of philanthropy and impact investing in education to make high quality early learning accessible and joyful for all children starting at birth. She's currently also authoring a book on her learnings and the vision to combat inequalities in education. She founded and led the U.S. education practice for over a decade at a Meteor network and spun off Imaginable Futures as a new entity in 2020. She invested in and supported various mission-driven organizations to build an inclusive and equitable education system starting in the early years, always with a 2-generational approach. Her work has really impacted millions of early learners. She's been on numerous boards and governance roles in education and impact investing. She spent her first 12 years in a career in finance and was an executive director of Morgan Stanley. She earned an MBA from Harvard Business School after her training in Paris, and she's been honored as 100 Harvard Business School women in the Bay Area. And I follow her, and I hope you all will too, for her Small Talks that comes out weekly. Let me tell you about Joe. Well, I met Joe when I was at HRSA around social innovation bonds when he was with the Institute for Child Success in Greenville. He invited me often to Greenville, and we had many long and wonderful conversations as we traveled across the states across those states to gatherings and events. And now I so admire his work as he's now co-founder and CEO of Capita, and I'm honored to join that board. Capita is a think tank for the purpose to build a future in which all children and families flourished. What I'm most struck with is that he's now he was announced as a new Ascend Fellow. And let me tell you what Ascend says about him. He has many commentaries on issues facing Americans' families that have been published by Investors Business Daily, The Hill, Newsweek, Stanford Social Innovation Review, the Charlotte Observer, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and others. He has moderated public dialogues with diverse figures, including National Book Award finalist Jason Reynolds, former president of the American Enterprise Institute, Arthur Brooks, and architect Atali Pulte. Joe's been an invited speaker to the White House, First Forum on Social Impact Financing, the Aspen Forum on Children and Families, the LEGO Idea Conference, Think Future, and the World Forum on Early Care and Education. He graduated from Furman University with a BA in history, earned a master's degrees in divinity from Duke, and he and his wife Molly have a cute little 1-year-old AJ who's going to have a birthday next week. So I'm just excited to have my friends with us, and welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave.
Yeah, so let us start. Let me give each of you a chance to offer some opening reflections of this moment in time. Despite all these challenges and uncertainties, what are you discovering on your journeys that catches your attention and perhaps inspires you as you think about this relational future in growing a multicultural society? So Isabelle, can I first turn to you, please?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David. So I wanted to start with a few words of gratitude to you.
Cool.
So as many of you know, on this video meeting, the American Academy of Pediatrics issued last month what I call a historical statement on the importance of safe, stable, and nurturing relationships. And this would not have happened without your work on relational health for so many years. So thank you, David. But turning back to your question, so when COVID hit, I was working at Imagine Futures, a great organization, which is a venture of the Omidyar Group, founded by eBay founder Pierre Omidyar and his wife Pam. And I was reporting to my partners and board about the impact of our portfolio of grantees and impact investments. And I was claiming millions of children and families being, positively impacted. Yet, it was also apparent that socioeconomic and racial inequities were rapidly rising everywhere. So I decided that I needed to step back and reflect more systematically. And there are three big themes that are emerging for me. The first theme is education related. It seems to me that we keep, in many ways, hammering on the wrong nail to improve learning outcomes. So we have focused on the K-12 years and specifically K-12 schools for a long time, when in reality we have a human talent and well-being crisis that's really rooted in the early years. And as a matter of fact, 58% of children between ages 3 and 5 are not fully healthy and ready to learn, according to the Department of Health and Human Services. And this stat was actually pre-COVID. Yeah. And we know that those children who start behind are more likely to stay or fall further behind. So this readiness gap fuels the later achievement gaps in learning. The second theme is the importance of relationships that connects directly to your work, David. I have been digging into neuroscience, epigenetics, anthropology, developmental psychology, and there is one thing that is really, really consistent. There is nothing more important than relationships, especially in the early years. And I believe that the future of learning is relational. So, how are we doing on relationships? Well, not great. Neither on depth or breadth of relationships. The reality is that the number of relationships around young children has been decreasing. smaller family size, less children per family, more loneliness, lesser also older adults around our babies. A remarkable data that someone was sharing at the Stanford Center on the longevity recently is that only 3% of children report having ever connected with an adult above 65 with not a grandparent or a family member. Only 3%. And it's not only about the breadth or the number of relationships, the depth of relationship also seems to be going down. I've been tracking the great work of a pediatrician named Dr. Dimitriou at the University of Columbia, who has been looking at the baby mom dyad during the pandemic at the New York City Presbyterian Hospital. And she has observed a decline, meaningful decline, actually, a decline by half in the emotional connections between mom and baby during the pandemic that seems to be connected to a drop in IQ for babies that have been born during the pandemic. And the last theme that I wanted to touch on, David, is our mental health crisis. That impacts younger and younger children, impacts parents, impacts educators, and all those three groups are so deeply interconnected. So quickly on the positive side, I feel like we might be at the cusp of changes and positive ones, maybe even a redefinition of kinship. Mm-hmm. I see a lot of great work happening on intergenerational solidarity. I see a lot of great work in community healing, and in schools, a lot of great work on trauma-sensitive practices and relationship-centered teaching. So very hopeful about those signals that I'm observing.
Phenomenal. What a great start for us. And I echo every one of the themes you're talking about. Even in one of my meetings this morning, we were talking about mental health is the outcome of a relational experience. And how do we think about preventative mental health, at the same time that we're in a crisis, have to attend to those that are struggling, but the recovery from even those are relational. So you come right back around again to the same place and elevating an opportunity. And I see, like you, much hope if we keep elevating and making those kind of elements visible. So Joe, how about you? Let me turn to you, your first comments or thoughts about your journey, what you're discovering, what captures you, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. And let me add my thanks to Isabelle's for your fantastic work, and particularly the work on safe, stable, and nurturing relationships in pediatrics. We're living through a transformation in child health and general pediatrics, and you're at the forefront of that, and I'm grateful. The question that we're not asking, I think, is who are we? And for the last 250, 300 years, we have been fed a lie in the dominant culture of the West, that we are, and this lie is articulated by Hobbes and Locke and others, that we are, in the words of Adrian Pabst, solitary selves bound to one another in a contract of mutual self-interest. This is false. This is not real life. And fundamentally, at a cultural level, this is what makes relationship in the United States so very challenging at this moment. Yet hopefully we're living through not only an era of change, but a change of era. And I think that we can get rid of this lie. We can put this lie behind us and affirm for our future that we are relational selves, that it's not just good for us to be relational, it is who we are. And so I think we're living through, and we have an opportunity to catalyze a transformation in anthropology, a transformation in who we believe we are as human beings, and to throw the lie of the last 300 years in our dominant Western culture behind us, to rediscover older and more relational traditions, to bring those forward to the present, and to make them a part of our practice and a part of the culture of this new era into which we are emerging.
Well, that really gets us going too, Joe. I am so with you on that. I had some of that beginning conversation, but you're carrying it so much further. I've been recently struck by what we're learning out of it in the indigenous communities around this kind of thinking, that sense of interconnectedness, as well as, so many of even our African American colleagues and others have been talking much about the deep connection in communities that really matters, in terms of how they manage themselves under tremendous strain and challenge of racism and all the disparities. So this change of our era to reaffirming that we're deeply relational really resonates deeply with me too. So Isabelle, I'm curious, you started your small talks back March 12th. That was your first session. And now we're up to 32, right? Which is phenomenal. So, and I'm wondering, what's been the reception of your network? I mean, that this little network you've created out there, to your reflections and your musings. What are some of the most interesting moments you've had along that journey? What has jumped out to you about your experience of sharing your reflections, what you're witnessing and seeing? Talk about that. Your thoughts.
Yeah, so I had started small talks initially to share what I was learning along the way, and I thought it might be interesting for a few other people and a few other friends around me. And the reception has been candidly stronger than I thought it would be. And I think some of the really interesting moments there, and let me point to two of them. So one is at the beginning when I started this, and maybe let's say, we were number 2 or number 3 of small talks. My husband asked me, well, do you feel like you will have enough content to continue doing this every week? And every week I do this and I need to actually subtract content. So what has been really, really interesting and fascinating to watch is the pace of research in particular is extraordinary in the early years. What we are learning on the brain and what we are learning, across many areas, but is really, really more than to fill one newsletter every week, and gives me a lot of hope for what is to come. The other really interesting revelation for me was reasonably recently. It was for Small Talks number 30. I decided to put together a list of my top 30 books in early childhood education. And when I put the list together, most of the authors were white. And I had, this a little bit of a ha-ha moment around, okay, is it and questions also about myself. Is it what I, Isabelle, I'm reading, or is it more broadly, the field of research and intellectuals in early childhood that are being promoted as such? That's a field that's still not diverse and as representative as it could be.
Wow. That's a really sort of startling moment of reflection that, noting that most of what's come at you, what you're seeing in the books you've written have been written by whites. And I'm curious about that on one hand. The second thing I'm wondering about is the reception you're hearing, any counterpoints you've had from what's out there in the web that you welcome people's comments to you. Have there been any pushbacks or rather than welcomes? I'm curious about. And then the third thing is, what are you seeing in the research that's relational? So much of the science and the brain development strikes me has been a lot of the individual person and brain development. And I'm wondering what you're seeing that's relational in terms of looking at how the relational forces are both healing and the impacts on brains. Anything that jumps out to you?
So a lot of what I've been reading actually uh, is about relationships and relational. I think even within or the intersection of neuroscience and practices in education is very much converging onto saying a few things. One is that learning is social by nature, and two, that the brain develops in such a way that is fed by relationships and context. Very much going into that direction. In terms of questions of pushback that I've been getting, a lot of interesting questions, as you might suspect, on different theories of education. So people coming on, okay, well, as making some suggestion on featuring more, let's say, Montessori education, or questions about free range, play, or those types of which I would categorize under one umbrella of more specific questions that relate to a model of education. And on the other area of questions has been more on policy. And some really interesting ones that have to do with relational around, that keep coming up in the policy area around, is it better to have a child in childcare or a child at home, and is it either or both at the same time? So that seems to be the perennial question as well, that has come up on multiple times. Wouldn't say necessarily as pushback, but as an interesting question.
It remains a really interesting question. We could talk ever further about the sense of single age group gatherings of young children in childcare versus multi-age group gatherings, and then that whole sense of family leave and the relational health promotion activities that comes as a result of family leave versus the childcare experiences of supports, etc. There's a lot there. We can maybe come back to that. But Joe, let me turn to you, and I was really thrilled to see your acceptance as an Ascend Fellow. I think, first of all, congratulations to you, and more importantly, congratulations to them to engage you. And I'm just curious, first of all, what are your hopes for the fellowship? Why did you apply? And then secondly, what do you think about your work brought them to be interested in you and what you're leading? I'm really curious your thoughts and reflections.
Well, thanks. I'm very humbled to be counted among a number of fellows from previous cohorts whom I deeply admire, people like Myra Jones-Taylor and Mario Small and others. I want to say that first of all, the thing I'm most excited about is the network, right? And in particular, the network of people who are making transformative change for children and families who are outside the early childhood or the 0 to 5 space where I've spent my career, right? And so I think that so much good can happen at the contact zones of different disciplines, system sectors, and people who are working with other age groups, other types of families than I am. So that I think is the thing that I'm probably most excited about. In terms of what maybe led them to I think it's an affirmation of the work that we're doing at Capita, which is, among other things, deeply cultural. And I think my initial comments, I pointed to that we're living through a moment where the culture is shifting, and we need to make sure that the culture is shifting in ways that are humane, that foster the flourishing and well-being of children and families. And we try, underlying policy, underlying all of the decisions that we make at that level for children and families is a culture that I think it has been, as I said, telling us a lie about who we are. We're not solitary selves. bound to one another in mutual contract. We're deeply relational. We want to give and to receive care. We need to give and to receive care. We are dependent, and there is dignity in dependence. Dignity is not to be found solely in autonomy. And so, these are the sorts of cultural questions that I think Capita is wrestling with, and we're trying to work out the policy implications of some answers to those questions. So I think, maybe that's our distinctive contribution to the space right now.
That's truly phenomenal. And especially thinking about the policy barriers that exist right now to really being relational, and more that support the relational foundations of future well-being. And, there's a litany that we could point to. And some of the Build Back Better agenda that's coming forth gives us some opportunities to open new space and new learning. Yet we're still, some of the fundamental assumptions still are at an individual level rather than the relational level. And I think you're right, Joe. I'm really excited that we can continue to push. It's opening, the doors are opening, but we have so much to do and to study and to learn. Isabelle, let me come back to you. Just this week, your 32nd edition of Small Talks came out. And I noted two elements. I mean, every time I read them, I find much more that I wish I could be spending full-time studying and reading and reflecting of all that you bring forth. But two jumped out to me. One, you mentioned that you're reading The Power of Discord by Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold, where it shows how the critical, inevitable dissonance of human connection is the path to better relationships, social emotional development. The second one that jumped out to me was Pamela Cantor's detailed piece, All Children Thriving, where her work outlines a vision for whole child development. And there was a quote, and Joe may touch you too. There's no separation of nurture and nature, biological and environmental, or brain and behavior, only the collaboration between them. That quote just resonates with what we're talking about here. So Isabelle, first your comments and thoughts here, and then Joe, I'll come to you on your thoughts there, then we'll keep going.
Yeah, actually, this is very interesting. The two readings are so deeply connected. There is also a chapter in Ed Tronick and Claudia Gold's book about exactly that, about nature, nature and nurture actually converging. So, so the quote from Pam Cantor is just really, really connected to the book. Very, very similar, converging onto the same thinking. Most of you would know that Ed Tronick did the big experiment in the 70s about called the still-faced experiment, that has really shown the power of emotional connections.
Mm-hmm.
And that experiment has come to another light during COVID, and has been reconducted to see if mask wearing was a driver of potentially lesser emotional connection. And on the good news side is that it's not. So the new experiment that has been conducted on still face doesn't conclude that masks, which have been wearing in many other cultures, drive lesser emotional connections. Anyway, but the books are really liked, in particular this idea of discord or uncertainty, and how to make to turn uncertainty and discord with others into growth. Whether personal or collective growth. I really, really liked that idea that underpins the Power of Discord book.
That's phenomenal. It makes me think about the separation and reunion, the conflict recovery, which is so deeply bound in all relationships and all relational elements, if not in the regulation of affect that we each have, which is there has to be a co-regulation process for becoming strongly individual and back. It's a really interesting context. And And Joe, I'm curious your reaction to the quote, "There's no separation of nurture and nature, biology and environment, brain and behavior, only collaboration." It makes me think about cultural anthropology. It makes me think about moving beyond that 300 years, looking about what we've known much deeper for the, that's in deep traditions, and how you think about that, what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear to me, right, that this gets at a truth again, which since the Enlightenment we've been told a lie, and the lie here is that we are somehow abstracted and above nature, that we're not embedded in the relationships, the human relationships, but also in human communities, but that we're also embedded in the natural relationships and natural communities of which we are a part, right? And so who I am by nature, who I am by nurture, is dependent upon these relationships and these communities in which I have been formed, right? And so, and that's actually the word that I prefer to nurture. I prefer to think about formation, right? I am formed to be who I am, and so I think that the quote gets at a very obvious truth, but of course it's always important to state those truths again and again.
And Joe, can I push you a little further? You and I remember our drive from South Carolina to North Carolina, and we got into an really wonderful dialogue about the spirituality of this work. And we might want to just venture there for a moment. Your thoughts and comments about the historical nature, the cultural nature of spirituality, and how that is likewise both lost and a part of what we're trying to talk about. Your reflections?
Yeah, I mean, I think we live in a cultural context, the dominant culture of the West, which wants to see us as machines and increasingly as computers, and also wants to enhance our human capacities with computers, right? With technology that is from outside of ourselves. And so, I think it's just from the spiritual perspective, right, that we are, in my view, embodied spirits. We are spiritual beings. There's a transcendent horizon against which we live our lives, and a higher purpose, right? A higher purpose in terms of how we give and receive care. We want to give and receive care. We want to give ourselves to others. Why? Not because we're going to get anything from it economically, financially, not because we're machines or computers programmed to give and to receive care. We do it because of this transcendent horizon. Some of us call it God, others call it something else. But that transcendent horizon, I think, is so critically important for what we're talking about. And it also gets erased from so many conversations. So Dave, thank you for at least asking the question, because so often we're in rooms where that question is not being asked at all.
Isabelle, any comments? I see you're listening, reacting, having feelings.
Yes. I've worked for many years in philanthropy and impact investing. And it's been so fascinating for me to see now that almost every single business school or undergrad program, but a lot of business school in particular, have now impact investing programs, and people wanting to join the impact investing movement, which suggests that this next generation, the Gen Z, are very, very interested in having their lives have more meaning and purpose, as Joe was saying. Certainly, there is research now that actually demonstrates that children who feel that their lives have more purpose are happier, and that spirituality doesn't necessarily need to connect to a religious practice. It's more this connection to meaning and purpose.
Yeah, thank you. In my own formation, I was taught that we as humans have the harmony of three major elements of our physiology: our psychology, and our spirituality. And as they integrate with each other, each is critical to the other and connected in terms of our future well-being in all ways. And so that has never left me. And I think here too, a part of our conversation. So Joe, let me come back to you. You and Ian Corbin wrote an op-ed piece for Newsweek. And it was on the U.S. healthcare faces a crisis of trust. And in all of our work in early relational health, we hear from families about the struggle of trusting systems. And more than that, the sense of how the structures of supports for families often don't give enough time for trust building. Or worse, there was not a levels of training in any level of really creating authentic, true, respectful conversations, the sense of doing to rather than being with in terms of these journeys. We hear it deeply in child healthcare and home visiting and the like. You want to talk about a little bit about that opinion piece, and then more importantly, what have been the reactions? Then what's come at you?
Yeah, so the piece, which was in Newsweek about 2 weeks ago now, sought to enter the conversation about trust in healthcare and trust in healthcare systems through this issue of vaccine hesitancy, right? But it wasn't principally a piece about vaccine hesitancy. It was a piece about, why do people not trust these systems that are telling them it's good for them to get vaccinated? And, the work that we're trying to do, which is deeply relational, the work that you're trying to do, Dave, Isabelle, is deeply relational. And yet we are trying to do it in systems, particularly health systems, which are focused on maximizing profit and in many respects are anti-relational, right? And so all of the work that we are doing, I think part of what the piece tried to do is identify a headwind that we're all facing in terms of this relational work, particularly in healthcare, and that is the systems that surround pediatrics, the systems that surround child health are focused on maximizing efficiency. They're focused on maximizing profit in ways that are deeply anti-relational. And so until we name the system as it is and describe the system as it is, and then figure out strategies for either creating alternatives within that system or building a new system, it's going to be very difficult. We're going to continue to face these headwinds in building a respect for, a value for early relational health and those safe, stable, nurturing relationships as fundamental to human health beginning in the earliest years of life.
Isabelle, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say this is such an interesting point that Joe is making. There is a parallel, I'm observing a parallel story in education with, the pandemic having driven a lot of families to consider homeschooling options. And there are different names for it, learning pods being one of them, or other ones. What is particularly interesting in this trend is that it is mostly Black and Native American families who are taking those options of leaving the traditional public education system, which begs a lot of really interesting questions on how can we best support those families who are thinking about other models of learning for their children, but also question of trust that Joe is alluding to, and certainly from so many angles in education, and here I'm thinking about preschool in particular. We know that thinking about discipline issues, expulsions in particular, they are not statistically equal across races. So this trust question is rooting also into some of the into how our system has been functioning or not functioning well for certain populations.
Exactly. And I want to start shifting our conversation because we're really certainly recognizing both the challenge and the opportunity, but I want to talk on the inspiration side. What are you seeing that's inspiring you, that you see as sort of foreshadowing the change we would hope for and wish for? And just a few days ago, when we were preparing for today, we opened up the concept of multi-generational models of child and family, multi-generational, multicultural gatherings spaces. And I wonder if each of you might reflect on that, because I know, Joe, you've thought a lot about that. We've talked about it. And Isabelle, I know you've been researching and listening and reading. And what are you seeing? What touches you that you think is sort of emergent opportunities that show this multiculturalism, this multi-generational effort, this sense of connectedness, the sense of being far more engaged in the well-being of all of us in those collective efforts? So each of you, what are you seeing that excites you? Joe, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, on the intergenerational side, I think there are more mechanisms by which people are able to take responsibility for our children's futures and to connect back to pasts that they want to bring forward. So Roman Krznaric, in his great book on being a good ancestor, highlights several of these. And I think you're starting to see, particularly in a European context, specific structures in policy and politics for people to take responsibility for their future, for their children's futures in more concrete ways. And just one example are these citizens' assemblies on various issues where people come together from across generations to deliberate and to advise Parliament. In the case of the UK, they've done it around climate. I think that the young climate activists are a sign of hope and inspiration. And then I can't but mention, and this will not surprise those of you who know me, I can't but mention the Pope, right? Who, by the way, it's his concept that we're living through a change of era rather than an era of change. And just this week, he greeted the World Meeting of Popular Movements, and these are people very, very close to the ground all over the world who are organizing, who are serving people in the context of integral human development. And he greeted them as social poets. And he dwelt on this term. You're not just philosophers or activists. You're not just artists. You are social poets. And you're weaving the poetry of the future from your work very close to the ground. So I think the Pope is certainly right now the most compelling moral voice of a global leader. But the people to whom he is addressing himself, and he was using his position, using the position of the Vatican to lift up these social poets who are very, very close to the ground. These are grassroots activists from all over the world, primarily from the global South. And just to lift them up helps us to see the world, I think, much more clearly in a much more hopeful way than we tend to when we dwell on our problems. These are people actually fixing problems.
Mm-hmm. And they're young, which is inspiring too. Isabelle, your thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, on intergenerational approaches, this is an area that I'm actually filled with inspiration and hope. I mean, one thing that's happening actually under our eyes, and in some ways not so apparent, at least to me, is the number of grand families, so families who live with multiple generations, like 3 or sometimes 4 generations under the same roof, has quadrupled over the past 10 years. So certainly there's been a big spike under COVID but maybe harder to find housing or harder to find childcare. You can think about some demographic reasons or socioeconomic reasons driving this, but it's been going on for 10 years. And Generation United did a survey during COVID showing that 70% of those people that have driven a lot of increase during COVID intend to stay within those multi-generational homes. They actually like it. That was also my other surprise, is that they actually like it. I think this is such an interesting demographic trend about relationships and where we are, maybe moving. I've also been looking into models that bring different generations together, and there are few of them, but some that have been rigorously evaluated have all pointed to meaningful benefits for the little ones, the adults, the older adults involved, and often if there is evaluation, also the parents are happier. There is one in particular, if you allow me for a few seconds to speak about, is a great program called Gen X that started in South Los Angeles in the Taft district. And the program is very simply older adults going to early elementary classrooms to help with early reading, big emphasis on early reading. So they recruit volunteers in South LA who come to the classrooms. And the program has, literally every single type of benefit you can imagine for the little ones. So, improved academic outcomes, better socio-emotional, better behaviors, better attendance, which was a little surprising. And then for the older volunteers, you also have tons of benefits. So, I'm not going to list all of them, but the one that really, really surprised me was weight loss. And wow. So effectively, those volunteers are more active. And to connect back to our prior conversation, I also think they have a greater sense of purpose.
Wow. That takes
Dave, can I just build on something Isabelle said just a moment ago? It's interesting, Isabelle, that you observed in the research that you were reading that people want to stay in the intergenerational homes. And I think just to connect this to a previous point, my reaction to that is, well, obviously, because they are enacting their dignity, right? Yeah. And it just makes me think, like, what is more dignified, right? The ability to sit down to dinner with multiple generations and to exchange stories and wisdom and jokes and whatnot, or to sit by yourself as this solitary, atomized individual streaming Netflix, right? And I know we're living in an era of fabulous TV, right? But to me, right, when I just imagine those two scenarios in my mind, and I know that every family situation is not ideal by any means, but when I just imagine those two scenarios in my mind, in one, I imagine people enacting their dignity, living into their dignity. And in another, I imagine something that's really quite sad. And so to me, it's obvious that people would want to stay in those situations.
I so agree. And some of the circles I've been in, I'm sure some of you are too, we're talking a lot about healing the culture and recapturing, historical dignity, if not the human person at every level, and how we took an unfortunate turn to our own struggle and the sense of recapture, which brings dramatic hope to me, hence back to the sense that of world leaders and community builders really starting to dig deep into being social poets in terms of the opportunity in front of us, which inspires me deeply. Joe, let me come to you. I noticed today, actually, Yeah, I received the notice from Capita about an event on November 8th. And the tagline was, in face of the UN Climate Change Conference. You're actually gathering a group of panelists to consider various perspectives on our ethical obligation to today's children, our descendants, and to mitigating climate disaster. Any little comments you want to make about that, please?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dave, for that plug. November 8th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a global panel that we are very excited about. And this came about because in August, we co-convened with the newsletter The Parents Aren't All Right, which is written by Elliot Haspel. That's another one to which you should subscribe. Tends not to come out on the same day as Isabelle, so there's plenty of room in your inbox. At any rate, we hosted an event with Elliot in August on children's rights, and that was primarily a U.S. conversation. This is intended to be the partner, and it's intended to focus on obligations. And I think sometimes we juxtapose rights and obligations. I think that they need to go hand in hand. They need to be brought together. And so not only do children have rights that need to be enacted, that need to be protected, but we also have obligations to children who are living today, like our children, but obligations to the 10 billion plus children who are going to still be born in the 21st century and then even beyond. So this is really intended to be this conversation on November 8th, an ethical reflection on those obligations hand in hand, in our view, my view, with rights which need to be protected and preserved for children. And of course, the United States has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Children. And so that's also a context for us here in the United States that we're sitting on the sidelines in the children's rights conversation globally.
Well, you can bet I signed up immediately when I saw the tagline, because it's critically important to hear these kind of conversations and reflect. So similarly, I think in front of you is on the tagline, the opportunity to go online to the Capita website to join on. So we have about a little less than 8 minutes left, and I'd really like some final reflections from each of you, maybe 3 or 4 minutes about, first of all, this dialogue, but also, this whole sense of what's in front of us, how things are moving, and what is inspiring for you, sort of a summation. We're talking about envisioning a relational future in a multicultural society, capturing our historical human nature at so many levels. So I'd love your final thoughts before we close. And Joe, how about if you go first, then Isabelle second? Joe?
Well, Dave, thank you for convening this conversation. It's lovely to be with you and Isabelle, and I look forward to the next time that we're able to continue this dialogue in person. Like I was saying, we're dependent, we're embodied, and so we need those in-person connections. I would just go back to a question that I asked at the very beginning of the conversation as we conclude, and that is, who are we? Who am I? And let's think about how we can renew, how we can heal, the word used, Dave, the culture, the dominant culture of the West, how we can learn from other traditions, particularly indigenous traditions from outside the West, from outside the global North, how we can heal the culture and relearn that we are dependent, we're not solitary, we're meant to give and to receive care, we're meant to be relational. And we need to build a culture. We need to renew a culture in which relationship is valued. And that's going to make all of the work that we're trying to do at a policy level, at a systems level, possible. But we need to spend more time digging down to the cultural roots, resisting the lie that we've been told that we're solitary, utility maximizing economic selves, that we are relational. And this has been the dominant lie of the last 250, 300 years here in the West. And I look forward to seeing how the social poets among us begin to tell a different story about our future, our relational future.
I so appreciate that. And Isabelle, some of your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, and David and Joe, you've been, leading the dialogue on the future of health being relational. I'm hoping to add my voice on the future of learning is also relational. And on Joe's point, this means having changes at the whole child, at whole person level, but it also means changes across the whole family, whole schools in education, and arguably whole community, which are probably the holy grail for the future of relational health, future of relational learning, and maybe a relational future, broadly speaking.
That's phenomenal. What a wonderful time to be together. I thank both of you, and also, of course, the listening audience. I hope you're all inspired as you listen to this conversation and you dig in ever more to really reflecting on the who are we, who am I, and this concept of the change of era and the future that we can all see as our social poets everywhere are really reimagining, and how the youth are likewise inspired about opportunities in front of them for all of us. So I thank you, Joe. I thank you, Isabelle, for your ongoing work. I thank you for the relationship we have and for our continued conversations. Just as a comment, we'll be meeting again next month with our next month Willis and Friends, Early Relational Health Conversations. And next month, I'm engaging Kate Rosenblum and a few other voices with us to talk about what's often discussed as how do we measure relational health, but there's a lot of really thorny issues about promotion efforts and not measurement. And we want to get into that kind of thorny state of learning the messiness of this good work as we're moving forward. Yet, we're all committed to the future improved well-being of all families and kids, which is deeply community-focused, multi-generational with so many opportunities. So join us. That'll be November 17th, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, and we'll have reflections, continued reflections in this space. So I'm going to give all of you a few minutes back to your day for having joined on with us for our conversation. And I wish you all well, a good Halloween and into November. So thanks for the conversation.
Thank you.